certification voucher. That's pretty cool. Our next presenter is Jake Backues. Jake, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. He's going to present the topic of advanced SoQL. He has 6 years of Salesforce experience between being a developer, team lead, teacher, and he's also the community group leader of the Utah Salesforce developer group. He's a certified Salesforce architect, and he's on his journey to become a CTA. With this, Jake, presenting.
Don't worry, you didn't get my name too far off. It's just Bacchus. Close enough.
That's great. So all yours.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so as Orlando said, I've been in Salesforce for 6 years. I started as a developer, and I'm now a consultant, and I do architecture and development work. Today, I'm going to be talking about some advanced options that you can use in SoQL. I'm not going to specifically go over any SoQL examples, but all of these should work in SoQL as well. So it should translate over pretty well. These are some of the things we're going to go over. We're going to start with talking about some complex relationships. Where to start your query from is also an important part of starting any SoQL query. And we're going to go over all of the keywords, essentially, that are available for SoQL. So we've already seen select from and where, so I'll kind of breeze over those. But we've got order by, type of, when, then, with, for, offset, limit, group by, having, using, scope. Yeah, all of those keywords. It's quite a few, but don't be overwhelmed. We'll go over them one at a time. So when you're thinking about where to start your query from, usually in Salesforce, you're starting from some sort of record, and you know that you need to get some other piece of information. So that's usually a good starting point, is like, well, I have to go from my object over to this related object. Hopefully it's related. Otherwise, I mean, you just query it directly. But when you start with that in mind, you want to kind of look at your limits that you have. And I'll go and open these links and just briefly go over some of the limits that Salesforce has. I don't think you'll hit this one probably too often, but you have 100 SoQL queries. And there's a number of ways around that, but and you can look at a lot of these limits as well, but that one's an important one. Basically, don't do your SoQL queries in a for loop is a good practice. I doubt you're going to have 100 different objects between your starting point and your ending point. And then your SoQL queries do have relationship limitations, so you can only go up and down so far. Hussam mentioned parent and child relationships. And so that's what I'm talking about, is when I start from, say, a contact, I can go up to its account, but I can only go up so many, let's see, so many relationships. It should be 5 levels, sorry, 5 levels. From child to parent is your limit there. And for child relationships, you can actually only go down 1 level, but you can do 20 different childs. So if I'm on account, I can get my contacts. I could get, I don't know, orders, opportunities. I could get 55 child relationships, but I can't go to, say, I'm thinking of a good example, but 2 relationships down. it's not possible. You have to separate out your SoQL query. So I put an example here of that. So a child relationship, you can see right here, is like getting cases from account. I can't also get case comments from the cases. I'd have to do a separate query from that. And so that would look like, because I know in SQL, you can do joins and you can pull in, you know, as much as you want, essentially. With this, you'd have to take your results, loop through them, grab the IDs of the cases, then do another query against the case comments in order to get those child records. Any questions so far? Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay. So with that, we'll take a look at the keywords. I just copy and pasted this from the link here. Not many people know all of these keywords. The use cases come up only every so often, but I think they would come up more if you know them. So if you start with SoQL, it just helps to know kind of what you're working with and what you have available. I think Hussam and showed some that I'm not talking about. There are some keywords that you can use within like your select filters, like today was a good example. And then Joey had another one. It was like the calendar year that you can use in conjunction with specific fields, typically. I'm not going to go into those, but those are also, there's a list of those that you can find online. And those are also very helpful. So the basics here, which Hussam went over, are the select from and where clause. Typically, you're not going to make a query without these three keywords. Where isn't actually required, but typically you're going to want to find specific data or filter the data in some way so that you're not just pulling in all of the records in your organization. Not necessarily that that's terrible, but typically that's not going to be a best practice. It's not going to be good for your code that's running. So you can see just a basic example where name equals a specific text value. This is something you can see in Salesforce. This kind of comes from SQL, MySQL. It doesn't really do much for us in Salesforce, but it's called an alias. So when I say from contact C, it allows me to represent the records that I'm looking at with C. So I can say C dot and get the field names from it. And it's also available in the where clauses. That's used, like I said, in MySQL because when they do joins, which is our parent and child relationships, they can use this to kind of compare the specific fields from other objects to this object. And we don't have the ability to do that in SoQL, not exactly anyway. I can't say if I'm querying from account and on the contact, I can't say where my contact's name equals my account's name, so to speak. It doesn't work that way. Okay. So order by. Order by lets you sort things in the order that you want. Shortest to tallest, ascending, descending. It's kind of the same thing there. You have the ability to filter by nulls as well, blank values, to sort by them, to filter by them, in this case, sorting. Reports don't really do that well. They just kind of say, do you want ascending or descending? And then they put the nulls at the beginning or the end with that. So that's something that's kind of unique about queries. And you can see what that looks like right here. Oops. Order by my first name, and then I can put ascending. Ascending is the default option. So you don't have to specify ascending. And then an additional tag there is nulls last or nulls first. We can order by multiple things, and it's just a comma separated list. So I can put a comma here and do last name. And again, since it's by default ascending, I don't have to specify ascending there. There are some restrictions on your order bys. You just can't reference all fields. A rich text field, long text, multi-select pick lists. We already know those are problem childs in reports as well as SoQL. It's no different. Data category groups are also restricted. That's specifically for knowledge thing. Am I going too fast? Does anyone have questions so far? I don't see any questions. Okay. So polymorphic fields are something we can work with. Polymorphic fields are a good example of those is your task fields. It's a standard object. It has what ID and who ID, right? Those could go, like the who ID could go to a contact or a lead, a person. It goes to a person, right? And the what kind of goes to an account or something, a what. But the point is that they can go to different objects, and SoQL can work with those because sometimes you might see people try and filter by like the first 3 ID. It's first 3 characters of the ID. That's the key prefix. But they actually came out with a better way to do that, and I'll open this up too. Probably have a good example. So you can see owner is an example, and I've got my event, and it's checking the owner's type of user so that I can filter to where my event is owned by users. It just helps you filter them down a little bit. There are lots of other examples here. Here's one with the task, like I was saying. My who type is contact. So these types are, they're object types, right? So it's also showing some more complex examples here. You can do some other filters on the polymorphic relationships, and they show it in code as well. The with keyword. So this one's pretty specific. So there's 3 keywords that we have access to that you can use with. Security and force is one that just recently came out. It was a pretty big deal when they released it. It's enabling your object level security permissions inside of SoQL. So basically it'll throw an exception if whoever is making the SoQL query doesn't have access to it. So this isn't really good for when you're an admin and you're trying to query some records, but it is really good when you go and write some code and that code's going to be ran by a user. This will enforce that security. There are other ways within code to enforce the security, but this will just cancel everything that they're doing if they don't have access to it. Another one is with data category. This is also for knowledge. You can assign categories to your knowledge articles. And so this is a good way to filter those down, but it's also pretty specific because you can do hierarchies with your data categories. It's really it's pretty extensive what you can do. And so they allow you to do an above, and there's a few other keywords. Let's get some examples. But so this is an example of your data categories, right? And you can do down here a with data category geography, and you can say above USA. And so USA is down here under North America and under WW. And so it would pull in all of the records that have WW, North America, and USA, because it's above that, or the products at mobile phones. So different filter. The last one is this record visibility context. This honestly was a new one for me. That came up. So I'm not exactly certain of the limitations of what it can do here, but you can see that it's got like different visibilities that are allowed. So it's also something kind of like the security enforced. So the 4 keyword, this is for asking us how the user will use the records that we're querying. So it doesn't really change much as to like what's returned in the query. But when I set for view, for instance, behind the scenes, Salesforce is saying, okay, that user just viewed this record, and it tracks that in fields behind the scenes. And the same thing for reference for update. It's saying, we know that record updated the record, or that user updated the record. So we're going to mark them as last modified, possibly. See. The for update is also unique in that it locks the record as soon as you query it. So if you have issues with record locking, where multiple tools are trying to access the same record at the same time, this will lock it for longer. So that, for instance, say your SoQL query gets back a specific account, and then later it tries to update it. It might error out later when you try to update it, saying the record is locked because someone else is updating it at that time. So if you want to make sure that your transaction has full access to that record during the duration of it, you can throw on the for update, and it'll lock it immediately. And then later when you try and do DML, you won't run into that issue. Now you could still run into the locking issue, but it'll happen at the query level instead of later on. You cannot order by when you do the for update. So there's some extra limitations on for update. That one's a little special. Okay. If you ever want to do pagination, you really have to use the offset and limit on SoQL. And this has a great example here of pagination. So in case you're not sure what pagination is, that's just where, say you have a list of 100 records, and it takes too long for your page to load at 100 records. So typically you'll limit it to like 20 records at a time. And then you can hit the next page and the next page, and you see the next 20 records and the next 20 records. In Salesforce, with SoQL, what you have to do is use the offset. So the offset says, if I have 100 records and I want to start on the second page, on the second set of 20 records, then I need an offset of 20 in order to skip the first 20 records. And it's very important that you use order by in conjunction with this, because you want the records to be sorted in the same way. Otherwise, you could be skipping a different set of 20 records. But the other half of that is if you only want to show 20 records at a time, not just skip the first 20, then you have to use limit as well. And the limit says, how many records do I want to get back? So offset is skip the first 20 and then limit of 20. So I'm showing out of 0 to 100, I'm showing 20 to 40, those numbers. And then you just kind of have to iterate that on with Apex in order to go through the different data sets. You'll have to use variables to change the limit and offset and show different record sets. Aggregate queries are, I believe, a whole other beast. I don't think it should even be considered SoQL. It's an aggregate query. It's very different. Even in Apex, when you reference it, it doesn't actually return objects. All of our other queries, they return contacts, accounts. They return the objects that you're asking for. In this case, it's groups of information. So it groups, for instance, in my example here, a count of IDs into a record called an aggregate result. Aggregates have a lot of functions available to them. And I see Joey used a count example in the chat there as well. Count, as soon as you use count, you have to be using an aggregate query. So when I said I wasn't going to go over all the keywords that you use on fields, this is an example that I am going over. And there's lots of different examples though. Max gets the greatest. There's lots of different ones. But the keywords down here are group by and having. So beyond just your select from and where, you want to group it by something. And in this case, I'm on contact and I'm grouping them by account. So that means I'm essentially looking at groups of contacts under my individual accounts in the org. And then I'm grouping them by a custom field just by their favorite color. So it's just setting up different groups of them. And then inside each of those groups, I will have a count of their IDs. Or, well, a count of the records, because they all have IDs. And then you can filter further beyond just your where clause with aggregate queries by using the having keyword. That allows us to filter by the aggregates. So I'm able to filter where I have contacts that have a favorite color, where there's more than one person that have a favorite color under that account. Right? So if I have 2 accounts, each one has a number of different contacts under them, I'm only going to get contacts back where at least 2 of them like the same favorite color. Something else to note is you can use aliasing here. And I mentioned aliasing before, where my contact record could have an alias as C. But in this case, we can have field aliasing. And you can see that up here as well, where I have a count of ID, and that one I did not alias. And then I have max for created date, and I alias that to max DTE or max date. And when we get that back in Apex, you'll be able to reference these this way down here. The field, if I don't alias it, automatically assigns expression and then a number after it. And it just goes in the order of the aggregates that you put in the select fields. And then I can reference my aliases instead if I put an alias on there. So it doesn't assign just an expression and a number. Are there any questions so far?
Not so much a question, but Fabrice has a comment, but I think he wants to do it at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I
Okay.
can do it now if you want, but I think it's better if I do it at the end so you can continue.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we can come back.
Okay.
Okay. With group by, I'm not really going to go into these, but just know that with group by, you can actually generate really report-like data, like matrices and things like that. With some of these functions, it has cube and rollup. Not going to go into that. They're pretty complicated. Using scope is another keyword. It has some really nice features that I actually didn't know about before preparing this presentation. Linda actually brought up the most common one that she uses, which is for finding private reports or reports in private folders, sorry. And you can see some examples here where she uses using scope, and you just put all private afterwards, and that's how you're going to get only the private ones. And then she filtered it further down here where she's getting private ones that are owned by inactive users. I wonder what that could be for. Could be pretty useful. There are actually a number of other words that we can use with it, and it's really interesting. It's for filtering down ownership, essentially. So I can see by territory records. I can see by roles, it looks like, mine and my groups that I'm in. I don't think that's public groups. Looks like it says that's queues. And the one keyword that I liked the most was everything. It's like if you need code to run and it just should have no filters, just throw a using scope everything on the end of that, and you'll never have a problem getting access to those records. There's a few other ones here, but yeah, you can take a look at those. Filtering by child relationships. So we saw how to query child relationships before, and you actually use a relationship name when you're querying the data of childs. In this case, I'm using a standard object, contacts, but a lot of times that looks like contacts underscore R, double underscore R, right, for custom objects. When we're filtering by a subquery, you're actually doing a separate query. So it doesn't use the subquery. And that has different implications to your limits. For instance, when I filter by a subquery, I get a limit of 2 SoQL queries that happened from one query. When I query this way, I'm actually getting 1 SoQL query and 1 aggregate query. And there are separate limits on aggregate queries. But aggregate queries are, as I mentioned, like these. They're a separate limit, but they're not used as often. So aggregate queries, I would argue, are better to go with if you can help it. But if you absolutely can't, it is possible to do this separate subquery in your where clause and filter by a whole table and not just the related contacts. I just wanted to briefly go over ways to hand off SoQL to your Apex. You can generate a map from SoQL. It'll automatically throw the ID to the record into the map. You could also just put them into a list automatically. And you can do what's called a SoQL for loop, where you don't actually store the SoQL query results anywhere, but you just iterate over them, and it goes straight into the for loop. There's a lot more considerations when it comes to working in an org with large data volumes. It's just a little more challenging to make a query that isn't going to throw an error on you or take too long, it's going to hit a timeout. Some of the I mean, you can look at these cheat sheets. This is a big one. It's nice. But this explanation was honestly pretty confusing for me. But standard indexes and custom indexes. So a field that's indexed, there are certain fields that are automatically indexed by Salesforce, and there are fields that you can request to be indexed by opening a case with Salesforce. And that'll help optimize your queries. Basically, it's like a form of caching those results so that you can filter on them quicker. But in order for it to be indexed, it has to filter out a certain number of records based on the total number of records that you have. And you can kind of look at those specific things here if you want to get into the details. But it just has to be, it has to filter out typically more than 30% of the total records in the table in order for it to be used as an index. You want to avoid full table scans, and there are a number of things that can immediately cause a full table scan. So they have something called deterministic and non-deterministic formula fields. You can look into exactly specifically what those mean, but basically a deterministic formula is going to be simpler. It's not going to be returning different results all the time. It's going to return the same result. And so that allows them to cache it, because otherwise you have to calculate it on view of the record. Typically, if you're using a non-deterministic formula, which most formulas are non-deterministic because you're calculating it off of fields on the object, it's going to immediately require a full table scan. And the reason for that, again, is because it has to calculate the result of that formula on every object in order, or on every record, sorry, in order for it to filter by that value. So be very careful with using formula fields and filters. There's also some taboo with using null to filter. I try and avoid it at all entirely. I've heard it's really bad, but if you use the query plan tool, it's not always terrible on your query. That was something that no one went over, but a query plan tool will take your SoQL query and analyze each of your filters and tell you how good they are filtering the records. And so what you can do there is usually if you have other filters before the null filter, you're okay. But otherwise, it's not necessarily the best to use nulls to filter. One other thing is when you use the like keyword, so where custom field is like something, if you use the wildcards, those are the percentages, which I think Hussam had an example of that. Don't use a leading wildcard at the beginning of the search if you can help it. That slows down the query significantly. The wildcard on the end doesn't really hurt you, but the leading wildcard, for whatever reason, they say is going to require a full table scan. This white sheet, extremely helpful for anyone who wants to go really further in optimizing their SoQL queries. This talks about a lot more than just SoQL queries. For instance, maybe you can't filter your SoQL enough in order for it to be indexed. And so there are some ways around that. You can create skinny tables, and that's configuration in your org that you have to go through. But there are some other things that you can set up to help optimize your SoQL queries if you want to look into that. And with that, since we're over time, I was going to go through some example queries, but I'm just going to kind of skip on those and go to Q&A.
All right. Anybody has a question for Jake? Fabrice, would you mind talking a little more of your remark?
Yeah, for sure. My remark, we discovered this quite recently, but the issue is if you're doing aggregation, SoQL aggregation through Apex, even if the result of your query will be 3 or 4 results, Salesforce will consider that if it's processing like 70,000 records in order to do the aggregation, it will hit the 50,000 limitation. So it's really a big mess because we had this on our project. We are doing a lot of aggregation. And up to now, it was working fine. And suddenly it was not working because we were hitting the 50,000 limit. And we just discovered that the way Salesforce is calculating this is, for me, bullshit. So you have to be aware of it. It's just if he has to process 70,000, he will count all the records he will go through, even if the result of the query is very short. So as I explained in my post, the way we choose to solve this is we are not executing the query directly in Apex. We are pushing the query through a REST API call, and we are just processing the result of the REST API. And this one is not counting through the limits of the transaction. So it's the way we are able to do a aggregation, which is very fast, very efficient, but we are not hitting the limit anymore. So I hope I'm quite clear. If you want, I will try to prepare an example. If you want, I have the code in my office. I can share the code if you want. It's very easy to use, and it's very easy. It's very an easy way to solve this type of issue.
Yeah, that is a great example of one way to solve it. You could also use offset and a limit to do that, but you'd have to pull your aggregates together with code afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, usually once you get to that much data, you just want to offload it from Salesforce. Salesforce isn't, I mean, I don't think it was designed for that, in my opinion. You could argue that, but it has lots of features to do those cool things for small data sets, but Salesforce is transactional and it locks all the records that you're looking at, and when you report on them with SoQL like that. And it's just not meant for that because you have people working in the org at the same time and you don't want to be requesting all of the data in your org, at any time. Just you start running into issues when you operate under that assumption.
Yeah, I do agree. It's just for me, the limitation is just that if you do the aggregation, it will be very fast. It's less than 1 second, but it's just it will count all the records he has processed, which is for me not the right answer because we are not using the results through the Apex code. We just want the free aggregate results. We don't want all the results he has been through. So for me, it should not hit the 50,000 limit. Which this limit, I really understand the point for Salesforce, but not for aggregation for me.
Yeah, I mean, even with an aggregate, if your grouping is very loose, say you grouped by the ID of the record, you could still end up with 50,000 results.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
That's why it's just a safe wall for them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, after I really love the limits because it's really a safe way for me to be sure that the code is okay. So, okay, but it's just for people to be aware of this issue so they know there is a solution and not to think that the aggregation will always work through Apex because it was really surprising for us. And second point was really, you explained it very well, like using like and the wildcard first. But for me, I'm so used to write SoQL SQL query, not SoQL one, that I thought that the first index field, which is the ID, will only retrieve 10 results, and then he will just do the like on the 10 results. But in fact, he's doing the like on all the results, which is a nightmare. So that's why I put in my post, if you want to do this, it's better to do the like in Apex, which is strange, but it's really faster than doing it in SoQL.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's something, but we have this in our code. We have, I think, 100 query with like wildcard at the beginning because we thought it was a good idea. So now we are processing every query one by one. So I just want people to do it through code if they can right now. It will avoid to have very long running queries for nothing. where Apex is far more better.
Yep. Unfortunately, it's not always an option that you have to filter it down so well, but you want to do your best to filter on index fields, and then if you can get it down to a few enough records, absolutely process those types of heavy processing things that are hard for SoQL within your Apex. It'll help a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot for the live presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.